Sandre here. Ever since I made my 2 videos about the Nazis, exposing them as capitalists, and thereby debunking historical revisionists who try to argue that they were in fact left-wing, I have been planning to make this video. I find historical revisionism, regardless of which political leaning it has, to be despicable. And just like it is undeniable when looking at the evidence that the Nazis were in fact capitalists, it's pretty undeniable that the Soviets were in fact socialists. Now, a common claim that you will hear from people arguing that the Soviets weren't actually socialist is that they were in fact state capitalist. In other words, they argue that the economy of the Soviet Union wasn't at all based on state socialism, but rather state capitalism. This is simply not true. However, it gets a little bit complicated when talking about the topic because the claim of state capitalism is actually based on one very famous communist, Vladimir Lenin. The so-called New Economic Policy was an economic policy of Soviet Russia, which was proposed by Vladimir Lenin. And according to himself, it was a progression towards state capitalism. He characterized it in 1922 as an economic system that included a free market and capitalism, both subject to state control, while there were socialized state enterprises who were set up to operate on a profit basis. Now, whenever I am confronted by historical revisionists trying to argue that the Soviet Union wasn't in fact socialist, this is one of the claims that I encounter the most. However, there's a problem with them proposing these historical contexts to sort of disprove the idea of the Soviet Union as socialist. It represented a market-oriented economic policy whose purpose was to foster the economy. Instead of a complete nationalization, Vladimir Lenin wanted a more mixed economy. The state would simply just control banks, foreign trade, and large industries. Now, if the Soviet Union had stuck to this new economic policy, indeed, it wouldn't actually be socialist. Problem is, though, the new economic policy was abolished by Joseph Stalin in 1928. And with that, we actually get into proper fucking socialism. Now, Joseph Stalin replaced the new economic policy with his 5-year plans instead, whose 2 main purposes were 1. Collectivization, and 2. Industrialization. Collectivization is in regards to the agriculture of Russia during the time, and it is a fundamental part of his 5-year plans. With the collectivization, he wanted to raise the revenue so he could fund an industrial revolution. He wanted to do this by exporting grain abroad. He also needed to feed the workers in the towns naturally. So how would Joseph Stalin accomplish this? Well, he would have to maximize production of grain. This is where the scrapping of the new economic policy becomes relevant, because after the new economic policy set up by Vladimir Lenin, the kulaks, which is another word for a wealthier peasant, they had controlled prices of grain, and it wasn't uncommon for them to hoard their surplus to ensure that the prices stayed high. Now, Stalin wanted to make sure that the price of grain was cheap. Stalin didn't want to have to increase the wages of the workers for them to be able to afford to buy grain. This is also how the Soviet Union went from small farms into huge collectives, which are called kolkhoz. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, in these, 90% of the produce would be sold to the state in a cheap manner, and the 10% surplus was to feed the kolkhoz. It was important to note that it could not be sold privately for profit. However, the collectivization turned out to be a bit of a disaster, and in 1934, they were gone. However, this didn't stop the collectivization, it merely prolonged it. By 1941, almost all agricultural land was once again organized into collectives. This time they had a so-called system of differentiation, and it was introduced whereby people with special skills were given rewards and benefits in form of housing. Now let's talk about the industrialization. Now there were a number of targets set for the workers under industrialization. These were set by the so-called Gosplan, or the State Planning Commission. Now these targets were set for essentially every industry, and even every worker. The justification for this was that it was thought to be necessary since most industrial workers had been former peasants, and they were simply used to working at their own speed before. However, Stalin's 5-year plan didn't give a shit about your working speed. And if you failed to meet the targets, it resulted in an increase of the target, or you would have to take a wage cut. An unforeseen problem with the industrialization under Stalin was that managers became more interested in quantity than quality. And so there was a lot of waste. Now let's move on to the second 5-year plan, between 1933 and 1938. There was further developing of the heavy industry, and it also branched out into new areas. Now these 5-year plans and similar economic reforms went on like this for several decades. It wasn't until the late 1980s that enterprises were called upon to develop in the final period of the state planning. In the 1970s, the agriculture of Russia became an even bigger part of the 5-year plans. However, a lot of the Soviet Union's agriculture was unproductive. Partly it was due to the climate. Only about 10% of the land was arable. But a lot of it was also due to the collectivization of the 1930s. It was simply inefficient. There was a lack of transport infrastructure, which also caused a lot of waste. Now, looking at different forms of property of the Soviet Union, after both the new economic policy and the collectivizations by Stalin, all industrial property and almost all land were collective. Now, there was some land in rural areas that had been allotted for housing, and people had certain rights to it, but it was never their property in full. For instance, there was a practice to rotate individual farming lots with collective lots. Now, it is important to keep in mind the difference between personal property and private property. Private property was indeed abolished in the Soviet Union. However, personal property was not. Meaning that there was no such thing as a corporation, but you could indeed own the furniture of your home. However, except for your personal property, there was no private property of the Soviet Union. It was all collectivized in some manner. Meaning, to argue that the Soviet Union was not socialist is simply factually inaccurate. Now, when you compare the economic system of the Soviet Union, especially after Lenin died, it becomes pretty clear that it cannot be called capitalist under any circumstance. After all, characteristics that are central to capitalism include private property, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchange, a price system, and competitive markets. About half of these are completely lacking in the Soviet Union. Also, to complicate things further, in a capitalist market economy, investments are determined by the owners of the factors of production, whether it is in financial or capital markets. Prices and distribution of goods are generally determined by competition of the market. Again, there's none of this in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, there can be many forms of capitalism, just like you can have many forms of socialism, but none of them are applicable to describe the economic system that was found in the Soviet Union. To argue that the Soviet Union was state capitalist is kind of ridiculous. However, when you look at the characteristics of socialism, there is a form of socialism that perfectly describes the Soviet Union, so-called state socialism, also known as non-market socialism. A very clear characteristic of a state socialist economy is a planned economy. The criteria of planned economy is definitely applicable to the Soviet Union. Now, if people wanted to argue that the Soviet Union is not the best example of socialism, I'm not going to have anything against that argument. After all, the Nazi Reich is not the best example of capitalism. But just because you don't like the way a system was run, it doesn't mean that you can just lie about what that system was. The Soviet Union may not have been the best example of socialism in history, but it was socialism. However, just like with capitalism, you can have different forms of it, and some variants may work and others may not. The point I'm making here is, the Soviet Union was state socialist. It was not state capitalist. The idea of state capitalism is far more applicable to systems such as the one found in the Nazi Reich or in Mussolini's Italy. Well, that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching. I hope you did find it stimulating. And I will be back soon with another video.
Не пропадет. Нет, не пропадет.
Потому что очень грустный и надежный народ. И пойдут колонны, города по большому. И останутся колхозы, Родиной давно. Убирай, окружай, окружай, наплодили сроки. Эх, урожай наш, урожай, урожай высокий. Не награды нас просили, это скажет вам любой. Скажет вам любой.
Мы хлеба свои растили ради чести трудовой.
Если ж к этому награда будет нам присуждена.
Мы не скажем, нет, не надо.
Мы